Okay, we're going to start off today with a brief discussion of the scientific method. The scientific method is a series of steps or suggested series of steps that will allow us to do science. Remember, science is based on observation, so that's where we need to start. We have to collect some data. Normally, it's going to be something that's going to make you go, that's a little weird or different. And that'll be a question that you start with. You'll wonder why it's that way, how can I explain it that way? And that'll lead us to our hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is an educated guess, so you have to do a little bit of education to get there. So we look at the past, or we look at what other people are doing, but those things will help us develop our hypothesis. For it to be science, we like it to be experimental. And experimental can be done in a laboratory, it can be done on a computer, but we want to be able to test our hypothesis, which will let us see what's going on and if our hypothesis is correct or not. If we do analysis and our hypothesis is incorrect, it takes us back to observations. We wonder why it wasn't correct. We modify, change our hypothesis, and retest it, and you can see how the cycle begins all over again. However, when we've come up with something that we like, or we think we found a good solution, or if we found the answer to our hypothesis, then we get into this whole idea of communication and we share our results for peer review, where other scientists will have the opportunity to look and see what our observations were, what we thought was a question to look for, what we considered our answer, and how we experimented in our analysis. And they'll do the same thing, which provides validity or accuracy or truth to what we are saying. Okay, one of the really cool things about science is the fact that it changes. It's not static or written in stone, it's dynamic, it's ever changing. And those changes come from new ideas. So those new ideas could be a new observation, or it could be the result of technology allowing us to make better observations, or it could be the result of an experiment that's a little bit different, shows us something new. Because we have this new idea, it challenges the old ideas, and then we have to change the theories or our models to fit in these new observations. An example of this is the geocentric nature of our solar system. We used to believe that the Earth was the center of our solar system, and around that, the sun and the moon and the planets all revolved, and even the stars, so we were the center of the universe. But with better observations, we were able to determine that it wasn't us, but the sun that's the center of our solar system. And our model of the solar system had to change from geocentric to a heliocentric or a sun-centered model. Another example where we see how science has changed is the idea of evolution. People used to believe that everything was the way it was and nothing ever changed, but we know that's not the case. We see things changing all the time. Primarily with plants, we can modify those, and that shows us that this process of change or evolution is going on now. Okay, the last topic for today is laboratory safety. And I know that sounds kind of silly in an online class, but we want to make sure that you have the information so that when you do have the opportunity to do an experiment in a lab, you know how to do so safely. The lesson is going to go through all of these different symbols, and it'll explain what they are and give you some really good examples of the rules that are there. So I'm not going to go into that a whole bunch here. Instead, I want to thank you for watching the video, and hopefully this will help you get through the lessons a little bit easier. Have a great day. So what are scientific skills? These are the skills that scientists use in order to do science according to the scientific method. First and foremost is observing. Remember, science is based on data, and data is basically our observations. So we have to be able to observe, and that's with all five senses. Scientists will compare and contrast their observations. They'll classify this, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. They use models and simulations. Models generally are representations of things that are really big or really small, and a simulation is more of a model that shows a process. Scientists also measure, they analyze data, and ultimately they have to communicate their results so the world would know what they're studying. And finally, through science, they're able to make predictions. The lessons will go through these in a little more detail, but I wanted to go over them with you real quickly. So we talked about measuring a little bit as being a scientific skill, and that leaves us with which measurement system do we use? We have three choices here in America. We can use the English system, we can use the metric system, or we can use the SI or System International system. Now, the simplicity of the metric system is down here, and this is what I wanted to show you. SI is what scientists use. It's basically a simplified form of the metric system, but it's set for scientific use. For example, we have length, there's 1 unit. For mass, there's 1 unit, and for volume, there's 1 unit. So we have the meter, the gram, and the liter, and that's what we use for each one. Under the imperial or the English system, that's where we start to see a lot of conflict. With length, we can measure in miles, in yards, in feet, and in inches. So a whole bunch of different ways to measure those things. With mass, we have a grain, we have a drachm, and we have a pound. So again, a whole bunch of different units that can use. And then for volume, we can use it in ounces and gills and gallons. So a lot more confusion there. The SI system, and the reason it's used for science is because quite simply we have one base unit of measure. Now, we get around with these needs of bigger things and smaller things by using prefixes, and we can see those here. You've heard these before. Kilo is 1,000, deca is 10, deci is a tenth, centi is a hundredth, and milli is 1,000th. So by using the prefix, we're able to modify this single unit here and make it work over a vast scale of sizes. Now, sticking with the metric system or the SI system, we have our base units of measurement. In science, these are the reasons we use them. Is it's simple, like we mentioned, there's only one of them there. So for length, we have the meter, okay? For area, we have the metered squared or the centimeter squared, depending upon the size of the object that we're measuring the area for. For mass, we use grams. For the weight, remember weight is a force of gravity. So for that one, it's going to vary a little bit. We generally like to use newtons in science, but it's not a normal measurement. It's actually a calculation based on the mass and the force of gravity. For the volume, we use the liter or a cubic centimeter. Okay, and then finally in temperature, most time in science labs, we'll use degrees Celsius. But when we start getting really super cold, then we'll switch over to the Kelvin scale. The key to science is communication, and part of that communication is making that data useful or so it's visible so people can see what's going on, and we call that analyzing our data. So quite simply, the first step is to put it into order, and then we can start to manipulate that data. When we put it into order, we have two primary ways. We can use a table or we can use a graph, and you can see an example of each. Down here, we have our data table, and that just kind of plugs the data out, helps us to organize it, makes it so it's there and easy to find per se. Then what we'd like to do is we'll take it and we can change that data into a graph, and by doing so that makes it visual, and that makes it a little bit easier to see and spot trends or patterns and things like that. Okay, the last thing I wanted to show you a little bit about is to talk about microscopes. Microscopes work by using lenses. Now, with a lens, what it gives us the ability to do is we refract or we bend the light. So here is our lens. We can see one over here, and if we take our object, you can see how a light wave is going to come through here, and through the medium of the lens, it's going to bend a little bit. And as such, what it does is we're able to take this image here of this little bug, and by bending that light, it creates a larger virtual image that we can take a peek at. Okay, the microscope started off with a single slide down here, just a magnifying glass per se, and then they started to put two of them together to get a compound microscope, and now we have ones that have multiple objective lenses, and these are kind of like the ones that you'll find in a classroom or the one we see right here in our picture. Okay, a couple pieces and parts of the microscope that I want you to be familiar with. The eyepiece, obviously where you look at. We have the stage down here, which is what holds the slide and what we're looking at. We'll have some kind of a light source, be it a light bulb or a mirror here, that'll shine light upwards, and sometimes they'll shine downwards, and that'll give us where we have our specimen here on the slide to look at. Okay, the lessons, we'll go over these a little bit more in detail and talk about the difference in electron microscopes as well. But that's about it for this one. I hope that it helps out a little bit, and we'll see you for the next video. So let's begin. What is biology? Let's take a look at this word here. Bio here means life, and logi or logos means to study. So basically, biology is the study of life, and that's what we'll be covering in this class this term. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about are characteristics of organisms. Remember, organisms are living things, so what we're looking at is what does it mean to be alive. Now, scientists have come up with a list of 6 traits or 6 characteristics that all living things have in common. The first of which is that organisms are made up of one or more cells. Now, you can be a single-celled organism made of one cell or a multicellular organism like us that are made up of many cells. But the main thing is that you are made up of these cells. We'll talk about cells a little bit later in the class. The second is organisms use energy. They use it for a variety of processes, and we'll be talking about those in the class as well. The third is that organisms have features that help them adapt to their surroundings. That means they fit in where they live. They fit to their niche. They have adaptations that allow them to fulfill a specific role, and that's kind of important for them. The next one is that organisms react to changes in their surroundings, and that's a response to a stimulus. So if you have an external or an internal stimulus, the organism's going to react to it. That's what we're talking about. The fifth one is that organisms change or develop during their lifetimes. It can be simple growth, or it can be a huge change like a butterfly turning into a caterpillar or a tadpole turning into a frog. And then finally, organisms can produce more organisms of their own kind, and that's simply reproducing. They can make more new organisms, and that's how they live through time. So that's it for the video here. As you go through the lessons, you'll get it in a little bit more detail. Hopefully you enjoy learning about this stuff, and we will see you in the next video. One of the things we'll notice several times throughout this course is that a lot of things happen in cycles, and we'll talk about these various cycles throughout the course. There are 4 primary life cycles. We have the energy cycle, the growth cycle, the evolutionary cycle, and finally an ecological cycle. And all of these are interrelated and interdependent, meaning that they rely on each other, they help each other. Some of them end where other ones pick up and things of that nature. So these cycles are all interrelated, and I want you to keep that in mind, not only through this lesson, but as we go through the course. Okay, first let's talk about the energy cycle. And the energy cycle is one of those that you have to learn as you're going through the class. There's 2 primary parts to it. We have photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is where we take carbon dioxide and water, add the energy from the sun as sunlight here, and we make sugars. And we also have oxygen as a byproduct. Cellular respiration takes that sugar and the oxygen together and generates energy that's usable for living things, and their byproducts come back here, and we can see how this cycle continues over and over again, and that's what we're talking about as it being a cycle. Now the growth cycle is going to be a little bit different for different organisms. Here we have a real simple example of them. We start off with little baby eggs over here. Those eggs of a frog are going to turn into a tadpole. Tadpole is going to feed until it gets a little bit bigger. It's going to lose its tail, grow some legs over here. It's going to lose its gills and get some lungs inside here. We get a little baby frog, and then that frog will grow into an adult frog, and the adult frog will then reproduce by producing more eggs here, and we can see how that cycle will continue around and around and around. Now the evolutionary cycle is going to be a little bit more complex, and we'll talk about that one a little bit later when we talk about evolution. But basically we're going to start with something like a mutation, some new thing. That new thing is going to be evaluated by where it's living. And as it's being evaluated like that, this is the process we call selection. So it's going to sort them into useful morphs, whether it's a good variety or a bad variety. The good ones will have the opportunity to go on and replicate. The bad ones will be killed off. Nature doesn't play games, it just kind of eliminates things. As they replicate, they will continue to go through this cycle, but occasionally they'll have some kind of a change, and this process begins all over again. Okay, the final cycle is the ecological cycle, and the ecological cycle is how we trace things moving through the ecosystem. And the things that we're looking at are carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, water, and oxygen, and all of those things are important for living things, and they all travel through a cyclic nature through the ecosystem. Now, even though there's 5 different cycles here, all of those cycles are interrelated and they depend on each other, and that's why we have the ecological cycle. Okay, so we'll cover that a little bit more in this lesson, and then we'll be talking about this a whole bunch throughout the rest of this course. That's it for this video. Go ahead and have fun in the lessons. Hopefully you learn a lot, and we'll see you in the next video.